Hello, everyone. I hope your week went well. My name is Erica, and the big problem I'm focusing on is the inequity in the quality of education for students with disabilities. This week, I'll cover an example of how inclusion is implemented in public schools. I work in special education classrooms, and I see firsthand how students with disabilities are often placed in general education classes under the label of inclusion, but they are not actually receiving the same level of education as their peers without IEPs. One classroom I work in is labeled general education. It's a co-taught classroom. There's 24 students, 20 have IEPs, and 2 are English language learners. So the support systems are not what they should be. There's no time allocated for teachers to plan together, no individualized scaffolding built into the lessons, and the special education teacher plays more of a role of assistant than co-teacher. It's kind of a cookie cutter, one size fits all. Here's a little bit simplified version of earth-based science. There you go. This issue is personal to me because I work with students who have incredible potential, but when the structure doesn't support them, they end up just going through the motions. These students deserve more than just a seat in a classroom. They deserve a real chance to grow, engage, and succeed. The results of this classroom often lead to the students just copying off of another peer's notes that could actually figure it out, and then they get C's and D's on the tests. Using Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, I'll briefly give one or two examples of the events that occur within each system that ultimately affect the proximal processes and development of the students from the example I just shared. At the microsystem level, the classroom itself is the most direct environment. Students interact daily with the teachers, aides, and peers, but when those interactions are unstructured or unintentional, learning is limited. If instruction is not adapted to meet the individual needs, the inclusive setting becomes more like silent segregation. Students may be physically present, but they aren't actively participating or meaningfully engaged. At the mesosystem level, the lack of coordination between general education and special education teachers plays a huge role. Without shared planning time, aligned instructional goals, or collaboration with the English language learner support team, this system that's supposed to work together to stay connected is completely disconnected. That disconnect leads to inconsistent support and weakens the quality of education the students received. For the exosystem, I'll discuss policies and decisions made by administration teams and school boards. These are settings that the student never directly interacts with, but that shape their educational experience. District rules about scheduling, staffing, and professional development directly impact whether co-teaching is actually effective or simply performative. In this case, the classroom qualifies as inclusive under the district's criteria because they label the classroom as general education. Ensuring this counts towards the 80% goal, but this criteria fails to guarantee students are included in meaningful learning. We'll get to that. Just say least restrictive environment, check. Idea Act, check. We don't have time to talk about the lack of schedule coordination or teachers' inability to plan lessons together because it's not built into their schedule. The lack of professional development to support the teachers, but those are all additional issues caused at this level. I mentioned least restrictive environment and the 80% rule briefly. These guidelines stem from the macro system, the laws and cultural beliefs that frame how inclusion is understood. The Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA Act, that I was talking about requires that students be placed in the least restrictive environment, with goals for an average of 80% or more of their day spent in general education settings. Hence the label of general education when we've got 22 students who are IEPs or English language learners out of 24 in a classroom that's general education. But because this lacks clear, enforceable definitions of access and engagement, inclusion becomes a checkbox rather than a transformation of instruction. As a culture, we often assume that physical placement means equity. That misunderstanding leads to surface level compliance instead of meaningful change for diverse learners. Finally, the Chronos system helps us understand how this issue unfolds. Microtime refers to what's happening in the moment, like the student not getting support during the vocabulary heavy lesson, which immediately impacts their comprehension and confidence. Mesosystem involves patterns over days, weeks, or months. When a student is consistently unsupported across lessons, classes, or grade levels, that impact compounds. They miss foundational content and fall further behind. Macro time covers large-scale historical events, such as when inclusion policies become standard practice in districts without the proper structural supports. Over time, these policies may appear successful on paper, but create long-term disparities in student outcomes. What begins as a label becomes a systematic failure to deliver equitable education. So that's my big problem: inequity in the quality of education for students with disabilities. Today, we focused on the structure of inclusive classrooms. I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever seen inclusive practices that actually worked, where students with disabilities were engaged, supported, and learning alongside their peers? If so, what made it work? Did it involve universal design, implementation of mandatory professional development, strict ratios of students with IEPs within each inclusion classroom, regularly adapting assignments based on individual students' needs and progress rather than a one size fits all cookie cutter model? You tell me. Thanks so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to hearing your stories and your perspectives. See you next week.